The sky was clear when school ended. The temperature collapsed without warning. Children vanished into the white. January 12th, 1888. The Great Plains woke beneath a sky so gentle it felt like spring. The air, after weeks of bitter cold, had turned strangely soft. Snow that once crusted the ground was melting into shallow pools that glimmered under a pale sun. For the first time in months, people left their heavy coats hanging by the door. In small homesteads across Nebraska and the Dakota Territory, wood stoves cooled. Men unlatched barn doors to let the horses breathe the warmth. Women opened windows just to hear the quiet dripping of snowmelt. And the children, oh, the children laughed as they ran to school without scarves or mittens. It was the kind of morning that felt like a promise. Farmers spoke of it at breakfast. The worst must be behind us, they said. Maybe winter was breaking early this year. Maybe God had granted them a day of peace. They could not know that far to the northwest, beyond the horizon, the real winter was waking. The sun rose higher, pale and calm. At the one-room schools that dotted the prairie, teachers rang the bell. The sound carried across the open fields, sharp and bright. Children hurried along the narrow trails, boots crunching over patches of thawing ice. Inside, the little buildings smelled of chalk and damp wool. Lessons began. Spelling, arithmetic, and the sound of giggles that always came when someone missed a word. Outside, the prairie stretched forever. Flat land, brown grass peeking through snow, a few distant trees. To anyone looking out the window, it seemed like a picture of peace. But the prairie has always been a land of sudden change. Behind that calm, the air was shifting. Around midday, a breeze began to stir from the northwest. It carried a taste, dry, sharp, metallic. Old settlers felt it first. A woman stepping out to fetch water paused, sensing the sudden chill. A rancher noticed his horses grow restless. But the sky still looked kind. No one wanted to believe that danger could come from such beauty. By early afternoon, the temperature started to fall. Windows that had been opened were closed again. The warmth that had brought laughter now vanished as quickly as it came. Still, the teachers kept their lessons going, and the children kept drawing letters on the slate. They had no reason to hurry home. The sun still shone through the glass, though the light had turned thin and silver. In the nearby towns, merchants talked of sending mail riders north before nightfall. A few telegraph operators noticed a static hum in their lines, a sign of a storm forming far away. But the warnings moved slower than the wind itself. In 1888, there was no system fast enough to speak across the miles of open land. By the time the message reached, the storm would already be there. Somewhere above Montana, cold air from the Arctic collided with moist air from the Gulf. The two fronts met like armies. The clash sent a shock of freezing wind racing south, a white wall that would devour everything in its path. But down on the plains, the people still believed in their warm afternoon. They trusted the gentle sun that touched their faces. As the hour reached 3, teachers dismissed their classes. Children poured out, laughing, chasing each other across the yard. Some started for home at once. Others lingered to build small forts of slush and snow, unaware of how precious those minutes were. A young teacher named Minnie Freeman, barely 19, watched her students play outside her tiny schoolhouse. She smiled. She thought of writing home that evening to tell her parents the thaw had come. The light began to change again. It dimmed not like dusk, but like a shadow passing over the sun. A thin gray line appeared on the horizon, so faint it could be mistaken for smoke. The wind paused, then returned, colder, stronger. It came with a low moan that rolled over the grass like the growl of an unseen beast. A farmer stopped his wagon to look west. "What in God's name?" he murmured. In the distance, the line grew darker, rising higher, a wall of moving white. Snow lifted before it, swirling upward like breath. Birds vanished into the sky, gone without sound. Back at the schoolhouse, Minnie closed the door against the sudden gust. The temperature fell as if the sun had been extinguished. Her breath showed in the air. She looked out again, but the horizon was gone. All that remained was gray. No one yet called it the children's blizzard. No one yet knew that within an hour, hundreds of lives would hang in the balance. But in that brief stillness, in that fragile warmth of the morning, the story had already begun. By late afternoon, the wind had changed its voice. It no longer whispered, it howled, a sound that rose and fell as if the whole prairie were breathing faster. People stepped outside to check their animals, only to feel a sudden knife of cold slide under their clothes. It was not the kind of chill that made you shiver. It was the kind that made your heart quicken. The sky had turned gray, then yellow, then green, a color no one trusted. Clouds gathered in thick folds, boiling across the horizon. In towns and farms alike, mothers called their children home. Doors slammed, lamps were lit before dusk. But many children were still out on the open prairie, walking the miles between school and home. No one could imagine how fast the storm would arrive. At Minnie Freeman's schoolhouse, the light began to fade. She looked to the west and saw the line of darkness growing. At first she thought it was dust, stirred by wind. Then the air itself began to hiss. The sound came from the sky, a strange whisper, sharp as ice on glass. In the next heartbeat, the horizon disappeared. The storm did not crawl across the plains, it attacked. One moment there was day, the next there was white. A blizzard so dense it erased the world in seconds. Snow, wind, and ice fused together into a single living wall. It struck with a roar that shook the windows and ripped open doors. The temperature plunged more than 40 degrees in less than an hour. Inside the school, the children screamed. Minnie fought to close the door, her hands raw from the cold that cut even through the wood. She could feel the air being pulled from the cracks as if the storm were breathing in. She told the children to stay calm, to move away from the windows. Outside, the roof groaned. Somewhere beyond, a horse neighed, wild with terror. Across the plains, the same story repeated. Farmers dropped their tools and ran for home, blinded by a storm they could not see through. A man searching for his cattle stumbled into a drift and never rose again. In the towns, lanterns flickered as the wind forced its way through every seam of every building. Within minutes, telegraph lines froze. The world fell silent. The wind carried snow like shards of glass. It did not fall, it flew sideways, burning the skin. Children caught on the road tried to shield their faces, their cries swallowed by the gale. Many turned back, but there was no direction anymore. The white surrounded everything, a moving prison. Steps led nowhere. Voices faded into the storm. The sound was unbearable, not just wind, but something deeper. It moaned like an ocean, endless and alive. Dogs barked until their voices froze. The snow rose higher, filling every hollow. Within an hour, fences vanished, trees vanished, even houses were buried to their roofs. The storm came from the northwest and swept across the Dakotas, Nebraska, and Minnesota with the speed of a runaway train. In one small farmhouse, a mother lit a lamp and waited by the window. Her son had not yet come home. She pressed her hand against the cold glass, whispering his name. But outside there was only white, a white so thick it erased both time and hope. The flame in her lamp wavered, then died. She did not know that the same thing was happening in hundreds of homes across the plains. Minnie Freeman gathered her students close to the stove. The fire inside it was already dimming, the draft too weak to feed it. She counted the children by touch, 13 little hands trembling. She spoke softly, her voice steady. "We'll stay together," she said. Her words floated into the dark room, almost lost beneath the wind. Somewhere outside, the storm screamed. Wood splintered. Snow pushed through the cracks like smoke. The small schoolhouse shuddered, each gust tearing at the roof. Many knew the building might not hold for long. She looked at the faces around her, pale, frightened, trusting, and prayed for the night to pass quickly. But the night was only beginning. The blizzard had found its full strength, and across the Great Plains, hundreds of children were still out there, walking, running, falling, each one a flicker of life in a storm that wanted to erase everything. Night fell early that day, not with stars, but with darkness made of snow. The blizzard had swallowed the sun before it could set. Across the Great Plains, families huddled in silence, listening to the walls creak and the roof tremble. The sound of the wind was not like any wind they had known. It was alive, a voice that screamed and howled, never stopping. Inside a one-room schoolhouse, Minnie Freeman wrapped blankets around her students. The children were shaking, their faces red and raw from the cold air that seeped through every crack. The stove hissed weakly, the last bits of wood turning to ash. She pressed her hand to the door. The boards were frozen solid, rimmed with frost. When she looked out the small window, she saw only a wall of white. The world had vanished. Some of the younger children began to cry. One boy asked if they would see their parents again. Minnie knelt beside him and whispered, "Yes, but we must be brave tonight." Her calm voice steadied the others. She was barely more than a girl herself, but in that frozen world, she was all they had. The snow thudded against the walls like fists. In another schoolhouse, miles away, a teacher named Lois Royce faced the same choice. Her fire had gone out. The children's breath turned to mist in the air. They were miles from the nearest home. If they stayed, they might freeze. If they left, they might die on the road. The wind screamed through the cracks as she prayed for a sign. On the open plains, people who had tried to reach home wandered in circles. They could not see their own hands. Snow stung their eyes, froze their lashes. Men who had lived their whole lives on this land found themselves lost 100 yards from their own doors. Horses collapsed in drifts so deep their riders never found them again. The wind flattened everything it touched. The white world had no edges, no sky, no ground, only endless motion and sound. A boy named Henry tried to guide his little sister home. They had left school too late, thinking they could make it. The wind pushed them sideways. He tied his scarf around her hand so they wouldn't lose each other. They fell, stood, and fell again. When rescuers found them days later, they were frozen together, the scarf still between them. Stories like theirs would fill the newspapers for months. In the towns, people tried to light lanterns, but the oil froze. Windows shattered from the pressure.
Even the snow seemed to make noise, a strange, hissing sound, like whispers from the earth itself. Cows suffocated in barns buried under drifts. Dogs dug frantically at doors, then disappeared into the night. Every sound carried the same meaning: fear. Inside Minnie's schoolhouse, the air grew thick with frost. The fire was gone. She broke a chair and fed its legs into the stove, but it only smoked. The children were so cold they stopped crying. Their bodies had begun to slow, conserving what warmth was left. Minnie knew they could not last until morning. The storm was tearing at the roof. If it collapsed, they would all be buried alive. She looked at the door again, frozen shut. The window panes rattled, the glass already cracked. Then she saw something, a faint shadow moving outside, or maybe just her own reflection in the snowlight. For a moment she thought of running, but there was nowhere to go. The nearest farmhouse was over a mile away, and in this storm, a mile might as well have been forever. She pressed her ear to the wall and heard the wind howl like a living creature. It rose and fell in waves, shrieking through the cracks, almost like voices calling. The sound of it made her chest tighten. But beneath the terror, she found a strange calm. She thought of her family far away in Ord, Nebraska. She thought of the children's parents who must be waiting, praying, and she made her choice. She stood, gathered the rope from her school supplies, and began tying it around the children's waists, one to another, like beads on a string. 13 of them, all trembling, all watching her in silence. "We'll go together," she said softly. "No one lets go, no matter what." The storm outside screamed, but her voice was steady. She wrapped the last length of rope around her own wrist, opened the door, and faced the wind. The cold struck like a wall. Her breath vanished. She could not see, but she stepped forward anyway, and the children followed. The rope stretched out into the white, like a lifeline cast into oblivion. Their shapes disappeared into the snow. Behind them, the little schoolhouse shuddered once more, and then went silent. The prairie was a white hell that night, and within it, courage moved quietly, almost invisible, but it was there. The rope trembled in Minnie Freeman's hands. Each gust of wind pulled at it like a living thing, trying to tear the children away. Snow lashed her face, cutting her skin. She could not see more than a few feet ahead, but she felt the rope move with each step, proof that the children were still there, still alive, still following. They walked in silence, the world a blur of white and noise. Every step sank into drifts up to their knees. The storm had erased the land. There was no road, no sky, no direction. Minnie turned her face toward where she believed the nearest farmhouse stood. The cold bit into her lungs like knives. Her hands were numb, but she dared not let go of the rope. Behind her, a little girl stumbled. Minnie stopped, turned, and pulled her close. The girl's tears froze on her cheeks. Minnie brushed them away and whispered, "Just one more step." Then another, and another. In that white wilderness, those words became a prayer. They moved slowly, the rope tightening and loosening with each stride. Snow swirled so thick it filled their mouths. The children's coats were crusted with ice. Their breath froze in the air. At times, Minnie thought she heard voices, shouts carried by the wind, but she could never tell if they were real. Only the rope and her own heartbeat told her they were still together. Nearly 2 hours passed. Each minute felt endless. Minnie's strength began to fade. She stumbled once, fell to her knees, and the rope jerked as the children stopped behind her. She forced herself up, dizzy, her legs shaking. Then, through the storm, she saw a shadow, dark, solid, a shape that did not move. It was a farmhouse. She pounded on the door until her knuckles bled. When it opened, a rush of warm air met her, thick with the smell of smoke and hay. The farmer and his wife pulled the children inside one by one. Some were crying, some too cold to make a sound. They collapsed on the floor, their faces ghost white. Minnie was the last to enter. When the door closed behind her, she finally let go of the rope.
All 13 children survived. By morning, the farmhouse was buried to its windows. But inside, there was life. Minnie Freeman's name would travel across the country. In the weeks to come, newspapers would call her the Nebraska heroine. Songs would be written about her courage. Yet she would say very little of that night. She only said, "I did what any teacher would do." But not all stories ended in warmth. Across the plains, hundreds of families faced their own desperate choices. In another schoolhouse, Lois Royce's students never made it home. They left in the storm, thinking they could find shelter, but the wind led them astray. When searchers found them, they were frozen together in a circle, as if still holding class in the snow. Lois survived, though frostbitten and heartbroken. In farmhouses buried under drifts, fathers dug tunnels to reach their barns. Some never returned. One man was found beside his lantern, only feet from his door. Another mother covered her child with her own body. When the rescuers arrived, the child lived. She did not. The storm had no mercy, but the people of the plains had something stronger: will. Neighbors tied ropes from house to barn, from door to fence, walking blind to rescue anyone they could find. They followed faint cries, faint shapes, sometimes finding only silence. Each rescue was a miracle carved from the cold. By midnight, the wind began to slow. The storm had spent itself, leaving a silence so deep it rang in the ears. Snow covered everything: fences, wagons, houses, even the telegraph poles. The world was white and still, as if frozen in time. But beneath that silence, life endured. Minnie sat by the fire in the farmhouse, her hands wrapped in bandages. The children slept, breathing softly, their faces calm at last. Outside, the moon rose over the buried prairie, shining faintly through the drifting snow. It looked peaceful again, but she knew what the morning would bring. The storm was over. The reckoning had just begun. Dawn came as a whisper. The wind had fallen silent, leaving behind a world buried in white. The first light touched the frozen plains, soft and gray, revealing shapes half hidden beneath the snow. Fences were gone, barns were gone. Homes looked like small mounds rising from an endless sea of ice. The Great Plains had become a graveyard of silence. Inside the Freeman farmhouse, the survivors stirred. The fire had burned low, casting a dull orange glow across the room. Minnie rose from her chair, her limbs heavy, her skin blistered from frostbite. She looked at the children sleeping close together, their breath faint but steady. For a moment, she let herself believe it was over. Then she remembered what might lie outside. She opened the door slowly. A drift of snow blocked the entrance halfway up. The air was sharp and still. The horizon shone under a hard, glassy light. In the distance, she could see only shapes: trees stripped bare, a fence swallowed by snow, a broken wagon wheel. The silence was worse than the storm. It was the silence of loss. Across the plains, families began to dig. They dug with shovels, with hands, with anything that could break through the drifts. Neighbors called to each other, voices muffled by scarves. They found animals frozen, standing upright, their eyes glazed in ice. They found wagons buried like tombs, and in too many places they found the small shapes of children. In some towns, bells rang to summon help. In others, they rang for the dead. Men rode out on horseback, their faces covered, searching for anyone still missing. They followed the faint lines of fences, the trails of footprints that stopped mid-step. Some rescues came too late, but others, impossibly, succeeded. A boy was found alive beneath a pile of hay, having dug himself in before the storm hit. A girl survived in a collapsed shed, her breath keeping a tiny pocket of air warm enough to last the night. For every miracle, there were a dozen tragedies. Families reunited in tears. Others could only whisper the names of those they lost.
By midday, the sky turned blue again, as if nothing had happened. The sun glared off the snow so bright it hurt to look. But the land had changed. No one could walk the fields without finding a reminder, a mitten, a book, a child's slate still marked with chalk. The papers would call it the Schoolchildren's blizzard, but those who lived through it would never call it anything but the day the world turned white. In Lincoln and Omaha, telegraph wires hummed again. The news spread quickly. Hundreds dead, hundreds missing, entire towns cut off. Families miles apart sent messages that would take days to arrive. The country read their stories with disbelief. How could something so deadly come from a sky so calm? Reporters arrived weeks later, traveling by sled and rail. They found survivors still trembling when they spoke of the wind. They found letters frozen in pockets, meant for families that would never read them. They wrote of courage, of heartbreak, of the cold that turned breath to ice and prayers to silence. Minnie Freeman refused to speak of herself. She stayed with the families of her students until spring. Her hands never fully healed, but she lived quietly, teaching again when the snow melted. Her students called her Miss Minnie, and sometimes, when the wind howled through the cracks of the schoolhouse, they saw her glance toward the west, as if she could still hear the storm. The blizzard of January 1888 would be remembered for generations, not for the numbers, not even for the cold, but for the faces, the children who trusted the warmth of a winter morning, the parents who waited at windows that never opened again. The prairie had taken them, and the prairie would remember them long after the winds had passed.
Weeks passed before the snow began to melt. It came slowly, dripping from rooftops, softening the drifts that had buried the land. Underneath, the world of the living and the world of the lost began to separate. Bodies were found as the thaw revealed what the storm had taken. Children, parents, travelers, animals, all caught by a force too vast to fight. And yet, in every town, people spoke not only of death, but of courage. The newspapers filled their pages with names, long lists printed in narrow columns. Beside each name, a small line, found, missing, saved. It was said that more than 200 died that day, though no one ever knew for certain. In some families, every child was lost. In others, only one. And for those who lived, survival carried a kind of quiet guilt that never faded. Church bells tolled across the plains. Funerals stretched for weeks, the sound of hymns drifting through the thawing air. Mothers clutched small gloves, small boots, mementos frozen in time. Men stood silent, hats in hand, faces marked by wind and grief. There were no words strong enough to match what they had seen. In the town of Ord, people began collecting donations for the survivors: clothing, food, timber to rebuild barns and schools. Letters came from as far as Chicago and New York, strangers sending blankets and prayers. The whole nation seemed to pause for a moment, hearing the echo of that distant storm. It became not just a local tragedy, but a story of the American frontier itself, the thin line between life and nature, courage and loss. Minnie Freeman's story traveled far beyond Nebraska. Newspapers painted her as the young heroine of the plains. Songs were written about her. 13 were saved, sung in schools across the country. She received hundreds of letters from people she had never met, praising her bravery. But she answered few. She did not want fame. She wanted the children to be remembered, not her name. In her later years, when asked about that night, she spoke softly. She said she remembered the sound more than the sight. The wind, she said, never truly stopped. Sometimes, on quiet nights, she could still hear it moving across the land, whispering through the grass. It was not a sound of fear anymore, but of memory, a reminder of what it means to endure. Across the Great Plains, monuments began to rise. Simple stones first, unmarked, placed where families had found their loved ones. Later, small plaques bearing the names of schools, teachers, and children. They were not grand memorials. They were meant for the living, to teach what the storm had taught, that life on the plains demanded both strength and humility. In time, people moved on. New families settled the land. The scars healed into stories told by firelight. But every winter, when the sky turned gray and the wind began to rise, old voices remembered. Parents would tell their children, "Stay close when the weather turns. Don't trust the warmth." And the story of the children's blizzard became a warning, passed down like scripture. Years later, writers and historians would call it a test of endurance. They would say it shaped how Americans thought of the frontier, not as a land to conquer, but a place to respect. The storm humbled even the strongest, and yet within that humility it revealed something fierce and unbreakable: the will to survive, the power of compassion, the quiet heroism that asks for no witness. When spring finally came, the grass returned. The snow melted into rivers that carried the memory of January 1888 far downstream. The prairies bloomed again, bright and endless, as if nothing had ever happened. But beneath the soil lay the stories, written not in ink, but in silence. Each gust of wind that swept across the plains carried a whisper of that day, a whisper that said, "Remember." More than a century has passed. The prairies have changed, yet they are still the same. Vast, open, endless beneath a sky that can hold both calm and fury. Where once stood lonely schoolhouses, now there are towns, highways, and fields of golden wheat. But when winter comes and the wind begins to rise, something old stirs in the silence. Locals say that on the coldest nights you can still hear faint voices carried by the wind. They say it sounds like children laughing far away, like bells ringing through snow. Maybe it's just the echo of memory, or maybe the land itself remembers, as if the storm never truly left, only learned to whisper. In museums and small town halls across Nebraska and the Dakotas, photographs hang in wooden frames. Faces of children in wool coats, teachers standing in the snow, faded letters written in trembling ink. Beside them, the caption, "The Children's Blizzard of 1888." Visitors pause, read, and fall silent. For a moment, they can almost feel the cold. The story is taught in classrooms now. Teachers tell it not only as history, but as a lesson in compassion. Students listen as they learn about the morning warmth, the sudden storm, the rope that tied 13 children to hope. Some cry. Some simply stare out the window at the falling snow and imagine what it must have been like to walk through that white world, hand in hand, trusting a young woman to lead them home. Every year, the land honors them in its own way. When snow falls over the prairie, it softens the earth, covering it like a blanket. The same snow that once took so much now brings a strange peace. The wind still sweeps the open fields, bending the grass, whispering through old fence lines. It sounds almost like breathing, steady, eternal, the sound of a land that remembers.
For those who live here now, the story is not only about death. It is about the thin thread between despair and courage. It is about the quiet strength of teachers, farmers, mothers, and children, all bound together by the will to survive. The blizzard revealed what the Great Plains truly were, a place of beauty and danger, cruelty and grace. And in that vast frozen world, humanity shone brightest when the light was almost gone. If you travel across Nebraska today, you might pass a small marker by the roadside, a stone set against the wind. It bears no grand statue, no gold letters, only a few words carved deep into the rock, in memory of those lost in the storm of January 12, 1888. No one knows who placed it there, but every year someone leaves a small wreath, sometimes a child's mitten, sometimes a ribbon of rope. When the sun sets on the prairie, the horizon glows in gold and crimson. The wind softens and the land exhales. It is then that the past feels closest, not as tragedy, but as remembrance. The children are not forgotten. They walk still in stories, in classrooms, in the hearts of those who know what winter can do. The Great Plains are quiet again. The snow falls gently. The rope has long since vanished, but its meaning endures. It binds not 13 children, but generations of those who listen. It binds memory to gratitude, loss to legacy, storm to silence. And when the wind rises once more, sweeping over the frozen fields, it carries with it a whisper, soft, endless, eternal. We were here. We were brave. We were loved.